Chair recognizes Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just start by saying, Sergeant Vargas Andrews, that your service is very much valued by many of us in the U.S. government. I just want to be on record as saying that Afghanistan has to serve as a lesson about forever wars that the U.S. gets involved in. And I say that as the daughter of a proud Air Force career officer who served in 2 wars. And I have a huge respect for the military, having grown up in that environment my entire childhood. And but I do think we also have to be very cautious about forever wars, and we have seen that for sure. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this hearing. In August of 2021, I made it very clear that I did not think this evacuation was executed in a way that reflected the extraordinary sacrifices of our U.S. service members and our Afghan allies. As a Democrat, I was critical of the execution of this withdrawal. Having said that, let me just be perfectly clear that I long ago thought it was time for us to get out of Afghanistan, and I'm not changing that. It's just the manner in which this withdrawal occurred. I continue, though, to have very deep concerns about the number of Afghan allies that were left behind and whose families now face unspeakable dangers from a Taliban regime that is once again persecuting women and girls and shows absolutely no respect for human life. But at the same time, here's what I am not willing to do. I'm not willing to ignore the 2 decades of intelligence failures that led our country to sacrifice the lives of so many of our brave service members and to spend hundreds of billions over 2 decades propping up an Afghan government that was utterly incapable of defending itself. And I'm not willing to ignore the fact that the previous administration did, in fact, negotiate the underlying agreement for withdrawal with the Taliban. This was not the failure of a single administration. It was the failure of multiple administrations of both parties over 2 decades. And unfortunately, our service members who put their lives on the line and those who lost their lives and lost parts of their bodies, our Afghan allies and the American people deserve real answers on why we found ourselves in a 20-year war that was impossible to win. And I just want to close with my remarks by saying, I started by saying that this should be a lesson in forever wars. I haven't heard it yet today, but I categorically reject any comparison of the Afghanistan war to what's currently going on in Ukraine and the United States' support of Ukraine, and I just want to make that perfectly clear. With that, I'd like to move to Mr. Lucier, please. Sir, your testimony was very helpful, especially in terms of understand the SIV process. And in the interest of time, brevity, I'm going to just ask you, you write in your testimony about the impact of the previous administration's travel ban and so-called extreme vetting policy against Muslim-majority countries. Can you help us understand what the impact of those practices was on the SIV program during that time, and what kind of fixes could be made?
Absolutely, and thank you, ma'am. So when we look at the SIV process, prior to the fall of Kabul, we were looking at an average of 4 to 7 years from submission of a COM approval application to issuance and ultimately travel, usually assisted by IOM, which SIVs qualify for. So how do we get to those 4 to 7 years, which is much longer than the 700 days earlier quoted, which constitutes the State Department processing time? So during the previous administration, one of the ways in which we saw this number particularly grow, COM adjudication and that approval process does take a very long time. But in the previous administration, what we really saw was a wait for folks who had submitted their DS-260 visa applications and were waiting for interviews, or after their interviews, a long time waiting for visas. So long, in fact, that SIVs are unique among all IV applicants, and that they will wait to do their medical panel screenings until they've been notified that they've passed security vetting, because medical panels expire after 6 months. Every other IV applicant can regularly be assured that that visa will issue after an interview before that 6-month expiry. But for SIVs, it could take much, much longer. So with extreme vetting, DS 5550s, and other additional types of security measures that were put in place, for example, the FBI bulk data collection that looks at social media and things, what we saw was that folks, after their interviews, saw incredibly increased wait times because this incredibly already vetted population that already faced very strict scrutiny with regards to security concerns, these extra burdensome, incredibly administratively inefficient processes really, really lengthened that time out for SIVs after they had already interviewed. So they think that they're almost through the process, and then they can wait sometimes years in an administrative processing black hole, in a refused status, in an INA 212G refused status for a very, very long time. So that period was saw a jump in the length of time it took for an SIV to become issued and make their way to the U.S. safely, as well as a dramatically reduced number of SIVs actually ultimately end up being issued, both because interviews were sometimes unable to happen, but even those who were interviewed subjected to these extra requirements could get highlighted in ways that there's lots and lots of stuff, but there's that extreme vetting and that extra layer of security vetting that again, this population was already incredibly vetted, really lengthened that time out and prevented many, many more people from coming before this disaster.
Thank you, sir. My time is up, but I appreciate your answer. Thank you so much.